Welcome to the channel, everybody. My name is Alex. I'm the N-Scale Reviewer. Today we are going to do a long-term review of my TCS command station. So let's just jump right into the meat and potatoes. I am running a CS105 command station as my primary power for the layout. I do have a couple other options that I do want to talk about. But for the most part, 9 times out of 10, this is the throttle that I'm using to control my layout. The UWT100 is by far the most premium of the products they provide, and I'll be honest with you, the encoder on this is excellent. It feels great in the hand, and it really is what draws you back to this to be using on a daily basis. I found myself feeling a little bit lacking with the original firmware on this. I had a Digitrax dual throttle at one point, and I had the ECOS system for a while that had 2 individual controls, and I find myself using that more often than you might think. And you could previously have 2 different models pulled up in the memory, and you could swap between them relatively quickly, but the new firmware actually gives you the capability to access both models simultaneously. You have a larger set of numbers, that's your primary, and then you have a secondary set over here. You can use the right hand buttons to adjust the throttle of your secondary engine set, and then of course the encoder will run your primary or the left hand buttons. This is a game-changing feature for this particular throttle. It makes it basically everybody's daily driver. It would be probably the best one you've ever used once you get your hands on it with this firmware. You can swap between the 2 models and it's instantaneous for the most part. There's very little lag involved. But the one thing that I find that I use this the most for is distributed power. If anyone has ever run long trains with distributed power, you're going to find out that coupler slack is not necessarily your friend. Say all of your locomotives are perfectly speed matched and you're not on a level layout, your forward locomotives will start to slow down as they start to pull the load, and the rear locomotive hasn't necessarily picked up that load yet, so it starts to push a little bit faster. This is just a recipe for disaster going through turnouts, or if you don't have body mounted couplers, it's going to probably start to mess with the alignment of some of your trucks with the rear cars. So what I did for the longest time was just run 2 different throttles. You would have your rear and your forward set of engines on separate consists, and you would just slow your rear engine down just a little bit so that it had time to catch up. With this, it allows you to have both of them controlled simultaneously, which means bringing up to speed and slowing down is substantially easier. All that I really do is I use the arrow button to bring them both up to the same speed, and then use the encoder to bump the front engines just a couple of speed steps, and that gives you enough flexibility that should you pull a hill or come through a corner where there's a lot of drag, there's just enough extra speed with those front engines that you're good with a DPU system. Now when it comes to the little brother, you have the UWT50. Now this particular one is the encoder version, or excuse me, this is the potentiometer version. This is by far my go-to when it comes to using the UWT50. This is my primary switching throttle, and as I stated in my kind of my first look into these, this is by far a game changer when it comes to affordable throttles. I think if money was the object, like you had to have a certain budget, this would be the thing I'd go for. It does not have the capability yet to be able to use the dual throttle mode, and I can see where maybe that's an issue with the potentiometer. It would be difficult to implement. I'm also not as much of a fan of these side buttons. I really prefer just having the standard array of buttons that the 100 has over the 50, but beggars can't be choosers necessarily. The potentiometer and yard mode really turn this into a switching machine. some of the things that I find really nice about this is no longer having to remember engine orientation. So for example, you have an engine on your layout in front of you. You can use your switch direction button right here to get it facing the proper direction, so that full forward is that way and full left is that way, which is nice because then you don't necessarily have to remember what engine is your forward engine when changing directions. Now, once you're kind of already in the throes of switching, that's already kind of intuitive and your brain kind of picks up for it. But I do remember several times on older throttles, you go to address a set of engines and you want it to move a certain way and it creeps ahead or reverse, whatever, which isn't what you necessarily wanted to do, and you had to kind of make adjustments there. It doesn't necessarily look scale, and so if that's what you're going for, game changer. It really does work good for that. The potentiometer has a much nicer feel than the encoder, in my opinion. Super smooth, and the detent makes it really easy to find the zero. This particular unit is the 50 with the rotary encoder. The one thing I like about this is when you are going through menus, you can use the encoder to click. It really does make interface management in this a whole lot nicer. So I have this set up in a slightly different configuration that I want to jump into, just to kind of show you what these are capable of doing. Okay, sorry, you'll have to bear with the bad camera angle for the moment, but what I have currently set up is my DCS-51, and it is running to the LNWI Wi-Fi interface from Digitrax. I had a bit of an issue with this system that I'll get to in just a little bit, but this has kind of been my backup for a while. And so this kind of shows the capabilities that this particular throttle system has. Okay, so now I got this back, and currently I have this unit dumping into my auxiliary in my switch box here, and I have it running to my yard. The 543 BN unit I have sitting right here is consisted or connected up to this throttle, and everything works as it's supposed to. The only thing about this that I will tell you is there is a bit of a delay in the amount of time it takes from a signal to get from this to the engine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and power up this throttle right here, just to give you an idea of the start time. And immediately it knows this Wi-Fi and it jumped to it. If you can see on there, it's asking to steal the loco. So this is taking control over the loco net and takes control away from this as its primary source. So I'm going to go ahead and accept that. And now this throttle, which can be used with my CS105, is now connected to my old Digitrax system through the wireless adapter. So let's go ahead and make sure this works. And I have 543 pulled up on the throttle. We'll swap directions. You see the engine moving there. So I have full control through LocoNet back to that engine right there. That being said, this is not a sound unit or anything like that, but I will say that this throttle going through the Wi-Fi into the DCS-51 seems to have a better, faster connection to the loco than going directly through this command station. Okay, so we're back up, and I now have the yard connected back to the CS105 through my switch box here. So you might ask, what do you do to get this connected back to your standard system? I currently have the CS105 connected to my mesh Wi-Fi unit that I have in my entire piece of property. I will say that if you are connected directly to the Wi-Fi that is attached to the CS105, it's a little bit snappier. I had to go into my Wi-Fi system and make the connection between the throttles back to the CS105 a priority. Otherwise, I was getting some lag and some occasional dropouts. It will also cause a little bit more startup delay that I'll get to in a second. So first things first is you press the menu button, and then you scroll down to, I believe it's option 6. Option 6 is your network options. And then you're going to select option 2, which is your saved network. And then you'll have your options for your Wi-Fi saved in there. And all I have to do is select my current Wi-Fi, which goes by the mothership, and select 2 to reconnect. And in a couple moments, this will be fully connected. And there we are. We're back to being able to use this on my home Wi-Fi system connected directly to the CS105. So the one thing, I don't know that I did a very good job in my preview, was showing the capabilities of yard mode, because I really think that is probably one of the shining features that these throttles have on it. So I'm going to do my best to show you that now. So I'm going to zoom in and show you a couple of GP30s I got doing a little bit of switching. Okay, I have this connected to those GP30s that are directly behind me, and I am just going to give it a little bit of right throttle, and there we go. Bring that to a stop. A little bit of left throttle, and there we are. And this is the feature I was talking about. Say that wasn't correct, go ahead and just hit the switch button. And now, if I push that to the right, they should back up. And if I push it this direction, they'll go forward. That right there makes switching so much fun. So as long as I've got these sitting here, I want to show something. Good connection is easily tested with sound units. The horn is usually the best place to do it. So if you just do a quick if there's not a good connection or there's a bit of lag, that will not come through properly. The other thing I want to state, as long as I got this in front of you here, is the feel. There's a really tactile click, much like an old remote. That is really nice. When you have some other throttles, there's not necessarily that kind of click point that you feel, that you know you're actually activating the function. Now I can have this throttle up and running. I can also jump to this throttle, and any one of these connected to the system can control this locomotive simultaneously, and that is a definite advantage for people like myself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press the locomotive button, and you do have to wait for this to populate your roster. I have a very dense roster, and it takes a moment. You have to let it fully populate, or it will pop back to the other screen and kind of cause an error. So we're going to pull up this model, which is 852, and we're going to go ahead and select that. And now both of these controllers simultaneously have control of this. So I can roll the throttle up, and you'll see it changed on both of the throttles. I can swap the directions in this throttle, and then I can do the same thing right here. Whichever throttle makes the previous input, or the last input, is the controlling throttle for that moment. This is important for me in particular. I let my son drive some of my locomotives, and if he's doing something that I'm not necessarily excited about, I can instantaneously adjust that locomotive by using the throttle that I have in my hand. So that is a little bit of a safety factor for anybody who might be wanting to let their kids use some of their locomotives. So this wouldn't be one of my reviews if I didn't go through some of the things I don't like about these particular units. And one of them is the lack of options. I only really have 2 throttles that I can get from TCS at this point in time. I would really like a base station unit. I started with the DCS 51. I mean, I still have it to this day. but I really grew to like having a physical spot that I could go to that was permanently mounted on my layout with the ECOS. Having the dual throttles on there, big screen, something that you could mess with all the functions, all that kind of stuff. It leaves me wanting a little bit. The dual throttle on this has come a long way to making me really appreciate this throttle. The dual throttle was almost a deal breaker for me there. Swapping between locomotives to do DPUs is just a pain in the butt. So having the ability to do that on this really kind of changed that. The other thing that I run into with this that is a little bit lackluster is I have a very large roster. Kind of don't want to say how many engines I have on my roster, but it takes a hot second or two to fully load that from memory on this unit. And so it will glitch out a little bit if you try to act too quickly. You need to give it time for the roster to load before you start selecting or typing a locomotive, right? So that's kind of me. That's most people aren't going to run into that. The other thing about this that I find that I don't use, other than this particular unit, I will use the arrow buttons to control my speeds. On the encoder version of the 50, you have to use the side buttons in yard mode, and I find it to be too cumbersome. I just never use it, and I don't really like it. So really, I don't find myself ever really wanting to use the encoder version. There are some, if you were swapping between locomotives, being able to be anywhere in the rotation and control the throttle is nice. But the firmware that they put in the potentiometer version pretty well makes up for that. It doesn't allow you to mess with anything until you're within a range of the current speed. So it kind of helps with that quite a bit. Really, I don't find myself wanting the encoder version. This one, if you really needed an encoder, I would tell you to make the step up to it because it is a drastically better throttle. Now for doing switching, this is okay. Yard mode does work with these buttons. It's relatively flawless. It's just that potentiometer makes it so easy to vary your throttle and make it look really scale. And that's why I like that unit. The other potential downside that I have had with these is the battery life. A lot of people have said that they do run pretty long. And maybe it's because I use rechargeable batteries. These eat up the battery, something terrible. I'm regularly changing the batteries on all of my units. They do have an auto off feature, but they do use AA batteries pretty good. So I'm not sure where other people are getting that. That has not been my experience. These definitely suck down the battery pretty good. The other thing that I don't like is these are definitely built for big layouts. These are for guys running premium big layouts. The e-stop function, I don't like where it's at. I find myself, the way I hold the throttle, accidentally engaging it from time to time. And I personally don't use an e-stop. I have physical switches that are readily accessible to me at any time. As a matter of fact, I leave my layout running all the time. When I'm not using it, I throw a toggle switch and it disconnects the entire DC or the entire layout from the CS105. The reason why I do that is I ran into this. The Digitrack system that I was running before all of this had the ability to go into like a sleep mode. And when you did that, it saved all of your throttle settings. So I could have engines running in a loop like they are right now, put it in sleep mode, come back in the morning, flip it on, and they were all back running in that configuration. Nothing had changed. So if you're setting up a tedious DPU system and you just want it to run, that's a good way to do it. Every time you shut this system off, it zeroes out all your throttles. So what I ended up doing is adding zones to my particular system, different levels, what have you, and I can toggle on and off between sources if I want to, because I can run DC. Like currently I have this top one running on a DC controller. Or I can swap between sources in case I have a failure. I did in fact have a failure with this system. I had been doing some rewiring because I am considering adding onto my layout at some point with like a module system that I could do some switching in, which is something I've been wanting to do for a little while now. While I was doing that, I started to have kind of odd power failures. Engines would be running and they just kind of stop, and I couldn't get the system to work again. And it wasn't like tripping the the short or anything of that nature. It was like it was powering out. And it did a bunch of testing, and I thought maybe it was the power supply getting bad. I ran it with my DCS 51, and I put a bunch of locomotives on here and had it running just fine. So I knew that system wasn't the problem. I reached out to TCS, and they were very supportive. They got back to me really quickly, asked me a bunch of things, got some questions. I wasn't ready to send the unit back in. I do some electronic repair in my job, and so I opened it up, and I found was the pin that comes out to your B power was the solder joint was getting cold, and it had cracked out a little bit. So I'm not sure why that was. Maybe I pulled on a wire a little too hard, something of that nature. But all it took was a little bit of flux, and I added just a little bit of solder, reflowed it with a heat gun, rock and roll. Hasn't had a problem since. So I should have been maybe triggering overcurrent protection, but it wasn't there yet. Maybe just wiggle enough, it wasn't getting a good enough connection. But that was the problem. To the end user, that would be kind of a bad deal. The thing was, I was doing maintenance. I maybe should have been a little more careful with the unit. So at the end of the day, that was probably my fault. It had nothing to do with the CS105. So other than that, I haven't had any issues with the physical command station. Just some onesie-twosie things with the throttle. That all being said, it did kind of scare me a little bit because I was just getting back into the video system. So one is none, right? I ended up ordering a Wi-Fi system for my Digitrax. I potentially would like to be able to connect that DCS 51 into this system. There are some ways to do it. It's kind of expensive, and you're jumping through a lot of hoops, so I'm not sure if I want to do that quite yet. But what it does allow me to do is say I'm not ready to hook my module system up, or I want to take my module system somewhere else. I can have that as my secondary Wi-Fi throttle. I can hook one of these up to it, and I can run it in a remote location. So should I go to across the mountains to my in-laws, want to let my nephew play with trains or whatever, I can totally do that. And then I also have the capability of having complete control of all models on my layout with one of these while he plays with the bench unit. So for the price of like $60 to get that, it was a cheap investment for me. The other thing I wanted to do was potentially look at the wired version of this. And so I figured that I would get the wired system and use it as a backup should something ever go wrong again. So that brings me to the last thing. The one thing that really does kind of drive me a little bit nuts with this and made me do some rewiring for the system was I don't have a constantly powered programming track. I used to drive locos onto the programming track, do programming, and then drive off. When you access your programming in this, it shuts down your main line, which is okay. It definitely works. I just don't like it. It can cause problems if you got locos running at speed and then everything just shuts off instantaneously. But I think what I'm going to do is run the wired one and connect it primarily to my programming track for non-Railcom locos. That way I can just use my switchboard. Right now I have it running. Currently this is just track power. I have it switched down so I can go into programming mode once I get a loco on there. You can do Railcom programming with this. It works 80% of the time. Works really good for speed matching. If you've never had that before, it is really a game changer. If you have any locos that you really want to have well speed matched, you want to do some fine tuning, you can basically set them at top speed, front engine being the faster one or what have you, and then you can access the other engine while it's running and in real time actively change your CV to get a really good speed match. So it really does work good for that when it works. If there's another 80% of the time, whether it's a little bit of dirty track or what have you, when you don't get a feedback from it, once that kind of happens, it is difficult to get that logo to connect again without resetting your command station, and I just don't like doing that. So I generally, if I'm getting to that point, I'm getting frustrated, I want to have a good programming track that is separate that I can be doing that on. So having a couple extra backups for a DCC system should I have another outage isn't necessarily a bad thing, and it'll be right at home, right here on the edge of my layout, so I can program right there and just have that wired one there should I need it to do programming, as well as have a backup. So I hope that was fairly comprehensive. This isn't like a normal review. It's not like they paid me to do this or anything. I appreciate all the help they give me. Whenever you have a problem, I have reached out to TCS. They're always back to me by the next business day. They're always polite, happy to answer any questions. And so I can't recommend this enough. When it comes down to the cost of performance thing, though, there is a few things to think about. I spent a pretty penny getting this. And the CS105, if you were not using a LCC layout or have no plans of doing it, it is highly capable, small, and it works good, but it is relatively expensive for what it is. An old DCS 51 like I have down here, you can pick up for $100 used on eBay, another $60 for the Wi-Fi, and then get yourself one of these throttles, which don't necessarily come with the CS105, and you're into a DCC system for a third the price. And that is, I mean, there's something to be said about that. However, if you want LLC and you want to be able to tap into that full 6 amps of power, it's definitely a good system to do so. However, I see that there's some things coming out potentially in the near future. It looks like they have an access panel that they're going to produce in the near future that allows you to connect one of these up to an existing system. If that's the case, and it's about $100, you could get that access panel, be able to run a wired controller or a wireless controller, and potentially connect it directly to a booster. The booster is $200-ish. Now you're talking half price, and you don't necessarily have to have the LLC command station. Powerful booster, solid electronics, as well as an easy to install patch panel. That might be a really good alternative to buying the CS105 if you're not necessarily into having the LLC control. So if that comes to fruition, that might be my recommendation in the future. When it comes to the throttles, if you were just adding this to a system where you already have Wi-Fi capability, if switching is your jam, the 50 with the potentiometer, 100% buy it all day. It's where you want to go. If you want to do anything other than switching, this is what you got to go with. There's no other throttle out there that can match the quality and feel of this that I've put my hands on. Even those ESU touchscreen ones, they have nice potentiometers. They do really feel good in the hand. They're just not as responsive as this. And frankly, they weren't as well connected over the Wi-Fi as this is. So that's something to be said. I really think this is the best on the market. And if you can swing it, the 100 is the way to go. That said, have a good rest of your week, everybody.